Good morning, everyone. So welcome, welcome back. So it's my great pleasure to introduce the keynote for our event. So please join me in welcoming Eric Heinze. Eric is a professor of law and humanities at the School of Law of the Queen Mary University of London. He's also the director of the Center for Law, Democracy and Society, and is the author of, many different books, including Coming Clean, The Rise of Critical Theory and the Future of the Left, The Most Human Right, Why Free Speech is Everything, and Hate Speech and Democratic Citizenship. So I think the titles of the book already indicate that this will be a very pertinent talk for the topics we've been discussing here over the past few days. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Eric to the stage. Thank you.
Well, a very, very big thank you to Tom and to his colleagues here, Stanislas and Tanas, and of course to Trisha, and to the entire Institute. It's really a great pleasure and an honor to be with you. I very much regret that I had to miss the last 2 days. You might say I was doing a dress rehearsal in Sweden. So let's see if that paid off. But anyway, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very, very much. Much of what I'll be doing is a bit different because, again, I'm very, very interested in regulation and its limits, and what that means in terms of democracy, democratic citizenship, participatory citizenship. But nevertheless, I think there are important overlaps. Very simply, the question is, how should online speech be regulated? But of course, I think it's become clear in today's discussions alone that we could spend months on that question, right? Speech is never, or communication is never a whole, right? It subdivides into many, many types, right? Commercial speech, military speech, what have you. And so obviously it's impossible in a brief space of time to go through all of them, but I want to focus on what I think is, in one way or another, quite central to our preoccupations and indeed to much of what we've discussed today. Namely, when may a democracy legitimately ban the expression of an idea on viewpoint selective grounds? Or to put it quite simply, when is it legitimate for a democracy to ban an idea because it's inherently, the idea itself is inherently dangerous, offensive, discriminatory? Let me flesh this out a bit. In 1965, and in fact even before, but just so we're clear, this problem was certainly not born with the internet. It's been around for a long time. The International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination provided that states parties, of which there are well over 100 today, shall declare an offense punishable by law all dissemination of ideas based on racial superiority, or hatred, or incitement, right? In other words, states must not simply ban, for example, crude invective, hurtful or harmful words, or name-calling, but rather any idea, any sort of theory of racial superiority would have to be banned. And indeed, this is largely the law in at least some Western democracies. Fast forwarding to 2015, we find the European Commission on Racism and Intolerance issuing a general policy recommendation, so itself not law, but intended to be a kind of soft law, to be influential and adopted with the aspiration that states will incorporate it, defining, in this case, hate speech as the advocacy, promotion, or incitement in any form of the denigration of a person or group of persons, as well as any negative stereotyping or stigmatization, and the justification of all the preceding types of expression, right? So going well beyond race In fact, it names 14 categories with the possibility of adding more, things like gender, sexuality, language, religion, and so forth. And indeed, this final clause is particularly interesting. It refers even to the justification, anyone who would justify any such utterances. So in other words, if you were prosecuted, presumably you can't even get a lawyer, because your lawyer would have to justify what you're doing. They obviously just didn't think about that. Not uncommon in the ECRI. But they couldn't come back to me and say, okay, well, we'll make an exception for lawyers, because, well, then what about thousands of people who might want to type out what the lawyer said? Or simply take the same argument. But then, if it's okay, in fact, to justify, well, then what about all the rest that precedes it? Right? So you can see that even in the offline world, right, and going back even before the 1960s, in fact, this has always been a difficult problem in a couple of ways. As to the online world, what it causes us to do is to completely revisit the risks of provocative speech. If you were to go back, I would say about maybe 15, 20 years, so not so long ago, right, there was already plenty of free speech scholarship. You had some people who were very much the kind of free speech advocates, most famously in the United States, kind of First Amendment scholars. Then you would have others who tended to be much more, who tended much more to advocate for bans on things such as hateful expression. And as the internet has developed, I would say in 99% of the time, everyone just kind of stuck to whatever position they already had and just wanted to extend it to the internet. So the free speech people, okay, well, we need free speech on the internet. The pro-ban people, okay, well, we need to continue and extend bans into the internet. Now, I think one thing that has emerged more recently is that that's completely untenable. There are problems of misapprehension of risk on both sides. As to the pro-ban people, you see, one of their arguments for decades and decades was that they basically favor free speech. They simply want to carve out a few narrow exceptions. Now, we see on the internet, this makes no sense at all. The narrowest exception will mean that you're banning usually millions of postings, right? And so there's just no such thing as a narrow exception on the internet. Now, as to the pro-free speech people, they also end up with problems because their assumption was always that fundamentally speech can be distinguished from conduct, right? That harmful speech does not necessarily result in harmful conduct. Again, the internet has very much given the lie to this, or at least radically reconfigured it. So there are problems on both sides. Both sides need to radically rethink their positions, and for the most part, they're not doing this. Another point which I think it tends to be overlooked is the distinction between individualized and generalized expression. Even most of the very zealous free speech advocates, people like Nadine Strossen or Robert Post or James Weinstein, again, these kind of vintage First Amendment defenders in the United States, even they have always accepted, and indeed the First Amendment of the United States Constitution does accept that the state can criminalize individually targeted aggressions, right? So the kind of idea that in the United States you can just say anything, that was never true. That was just never true. And in fact, much hate speech can and is punished in the United States, and particularly if it's targeted at particular individuals, particular identifiable. And so for me, when we're talking about regulation, and that applies online, right? If you're sending people death threats online and all of that, again, unless you're the most ardent libertarian, you're perfectly happy for the government to penalize this. Again, I've been doing this for a long time. I don't know anybody, actually, among the serious free speech scholars who thinks that this would be government overreach. The real problem is with what we could call generalized expression, right? In other words, people who are spouting racist or homophobic or transphobic or whatever it may be views, not targeting a particular individual, just in general terms. And as we know, there's tons of this. The reason why I focus on this, again, is because this is where I think the serious disagreements really erupt. But also because it poses the most frontal problem for liberal democracy itself, right? To what degree, if at all, can a liberal democracy tolerate banning from public conversation certain ideas solely because those ideas are harmful, hurtful, provocative, dangerous, discriminatory? And even in many ways, ideas that would negate the citizenship of other people in the democracy, right? We do that every time we have discussions about immigration, actually. Moreover, the big fudge word in all of these discussions is liberal democracy. It's amazing how often we just take this concept as a whole. And the jurisprudence does this, and the scholarship does this. Liberal democracy, I mean, the jurisprudence of the European Court, or of the Bundesverfassungsgericht, or of any number of French decisions as well, often simply conflate liberal and democracy as if it's a kind of undifferentiated whole, right? Now, anyone who studies the history of both liberalism and democracy knows this was never true. There are times when democracy is seen as a frontal threat to liberalism. Alexis de Tocqueville, indeed Plato, doesn't have the term liberalism, but the idea is certainly there. And the other way around, where liberalism is seen as a fundamental threat to democracy. Well, Karl Marx, if you view him as a radical Democrat, which I would, incidentally. And so if you're a liberal, your concern is with certain speech bans or regulations illegitimately invading individual freedom. At least this is my view. If you're a Democrat, your concern is with illegitimate invasion of participatory citizenship. And so I think we have not paid enough distinction in our approach to the internet to the distinction between liberal values and democratic values, because the internet is showing us that these actually conflict. Is your concern simply with optimizing individual freedom? I should be able to say whatever I like as long as I'm not directly attacking someone in a way that causes them some sort of demonstrable harm? Or I should be able to speak in order to be part of my demos, my political community. These values are actually often very much at odds. And so when we're talking about liberal democratic values, often we don't know what we're talking about. We're talking about values that are very much in contradiction. And so my recent research is, okay, can we come up with a liberal democratic model for regulation? Oh, you uploaded the wrong one. Okay, well, don't worry about it. Actually, you're going to have to change it. Yeah. This is the old one. I was going to start with Pericles, but I thought there was never going to be time for it. Do you have the other one? Yeah, I have it if you don't have it.
If you have it on a stick.
I have it on a stick, yeah. I was afraid this might happen. I do this at every conference. I send them 10 versions of what I want to do because I keep changing my mind every time I go through it. So sorry about that. Like, do you remember I sent you one yesterday?
Yeah, sure.
I think you should be able to find it on here. Don't worry about it.
I'm sorry.
I would I'd love to do starting with Pericles, but I kind of, at the 11th hour, I figured this might run on a bit too long. That's the correct one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Tom. No worries, no worries. Okay, so so my approach is skeptical about the liberalism side of this. In other words, I mean, I won't go into all of this now unless you really love political theory, but in a nutshell, I don't think that a value which aims solely at optimizing individual freedom is a political value at all. It's at best part of a politics. And I think this has been one of the big problems of liberal philosophy for a long time. So instead, my model is a democratic one, but not a pure majoritarian one. So it is working toward liberal democratic, but again, not in a way which simply jumbles the two terms together. All right. So let me just run through a few of these models. We could talk about a classically liberal model. I just want to work through a few models in order to explain more precisely why I think none of them work and why I am therefore advocating a democratic model. We could talk about a classically liberal model, which presupposes what I'll call a significant, not minimal, not maximal, but a significant distinction between communication and conduct, between speech and conduct. A kind of a landmark case in law goes back to 1969. It's this famous case of Brandenburg versus Ohio, the United States Supreme Court, where the court said that it would be illegitimate, it would be unconstitutional for government to regulate speech, to ban, prohibit, penalize speech, solely on grounds that the speech itself is somehow harmful or dangerous, but rather the state would have to show that there was a risk of imminent lawful action. In other words, not unlawful action 10 years from now because the theory has gathered traction, but rather imminently. So in other words, what they're imagining, again, it's 1969, pre-internet, right? So what they're imagining is literally a mob of people. Right? At what point can the state stop the speech? And the court set a very high bar. No other Western democracy, incidentally, ever adopted this. This is a purely American idea, right? That that at a point where the state, where say the police could legitimately determine that there's a risk of the speech turning into some sort of violent or lawless action, yeah, then the state can intervene. But not simply because it doesn't like the ideas. Again, of course, we know in Western Europe, no state, no nation has adopted anything like that. The problem in the internet world is that, because you have American scholars who still adhere to this Brandenburg principle, right? They want evidence of imminent lawless action, but what does that mean on the internet? Right? What would that mean? Right? Because the internet has kind of shown us the opposite. That we have no idea where an idea is going to land, unlike this Brandenburg case, which was on a farm in Ohio. You could point to it, right? The police could go there. With the internet, you have no idea where it's going to end up, right? We've had some important cases like this in Britain recently. And not only do you have no idea, but again, by the time lawless action, and I mean even mass murder, right, has taken place, there's no way, the police will never have had time to intervene. At least as the technology currently is, this could change, right? If we become a complete surveillance state, then yeah, all bets are off. So the problem of the classical liberal model, which incidentally I'm rather partial to in traditional live speech scenarios, but it clearly does not help us at all with internet regulation. We can also talk about what I would call the communitarian model, which envisages a weak distinction, in some cases no distinction, between speech and conduct. Those of you who are really into kind of post-Wittgenstein speech act theory will love this idea, right? And this has become quite dominant in the literature, not even particularly in legal philosophy, by the way. I mean, particularly within the social sciences and humanities, speech act theory has become quite current. And the idea is basically there's no distinction or very little distinction, right? In other words, speech is a form of conduct. Violent speech is already a form, just a variation of violent conduct. This idea is very widespread. Of course, it also has some intractable problems, right? In other words, if my speech is just as bad as a punch, and if in law you always have a right to self-defense, that means you should, by law, be able to punch me because of my speech. Again, something that no one has ever thought of. Big problem with the communitarian model. Which uncertainly also goes by other names. You could call it a more paternalist liberalism. Someone like Jeremy Waldron would be an exponent of it. You could call it Wehrhafte Demokratie, right? Militant democracy. You could call it critical theory, right? There are different versions of it. But they very much rely on the idea that fundamentally we can't distinguish, or can only weakly distinguish, between communication and conduct. Now, the problem with the communitarian model, despite its good intentions, is that I would call it excessively proactive, particularly as applied to the internet. In other words, it's conducive to massive overregulation of speech. And this has been studied by a colleague of mine, who's noticed how there's been massive takedowns, coerced takedowns, even by activists, right? So you had anti-racism activists, LGBTQ activists, right? So LGBTQ activists are a great example. They're using words like queer, right, as part of their activism. They end up being taken down by some algorithm because it's seen as hate speech. This happens constantly. And it happens in ethnic communities and so on, right? And so the communitarian model, again, I think has problems even in the offline world, but in the online world, again, I think we've already witnessed these values leading to, just to outright censorship, if only because of the crudeness of the algorithms and the sheer quantity of postings. Then we can swing to the other extreme, right, which I would call the libertarian model, which insists on a strong or even an absolute distinction between speech acts and conduct. Now, what's interesting about the libertarian model is that it exists pretty much nowhere except in a couple of political science departments. But it's kind of food for thought. I have a libertarian friend, and I have to say the one value of his arguments is that they really make me think about whether I can defend my own, right? So what they would say, right, is that there should be no liability and no penalty for anything except an actual act of violence, right? So if I punch you, right, fine, then the state can intervene. Right? And indeed, if I incite, so if I type some horrible stuff, racism or homophobia, whatever it is, and other people act on it, for the libertarian, as long as I was not committing the conduct, then there should be no liability. Now, the problem here is, I would say, precisely the opposite as in the communitarian model, as you might expect. It's excessively retroactive, right? In other words, if you take it to its conclusion, basically, you would have to just let the genocide take place and then just find the people who actually committed it, right? Again, that's never going to happen. I don't think, at least no democracy is ever going to accept that there's, right, that liability can only ever, attach to physical conduct. And even if it's a good idea, which I doubt, because, again, it brings us into this strange situation of we have to wait for the harm to actually occur. right? Which, again, no legal system has ever worked that way, and that's always a problem with libertarianism, is that they tend to do political theory like a crossword puzzle, just kind of in its own little bubble, attached from anything that you might call sociology. Now, if I had done this little lecture 10 years ago, I wouldn't even bother with this category. But suddenly it's become, right? It would say, yeah, well, obviously we all know. Well, as it turns out, it's creeping back, wherever, every time we turn around. And in particular, up until now, when we talk about authoritarianism, we talk about states, governments. We're witnessing a kind of privatization of authoritarianism, right? And so, once again, authoritarianism posits weak distinctions between communication and conduct, right? Right. To say something which is critical of Trump or critical of Musk is essentially to be treasonous against them, or Putin, or Xi Jinping, or name your favorite dictator. And of course, the problem here is just, it's beyond being excessively proactive. It's just pervasive falsification of risk. And so, for some of these reasons, and I could go into more, I think all of these models are deficient. Again, some of them make interesting and important points, but in themselves clearly don't suffice. They also have great weaknesses. And that's what leads me to think, okay, can we talk about something like a distinctively democratic model, right, where liberalism comes in, right, but without some of the defects of what we would call simply a classically liberal or indeed a libertarian model, right? And so then we have to look at what, for a long time now, we've understood as constitutional democracy, right? In other words, not simply brute majoritarian democracy, which I would say has a few elements. The most important element, and this is where I want to begin to distinguish between liberalism and democracy, is what I would call a core of citizenship. In other words, right, from one democracy to the next, we can find all sorts of differences, all sorts of variations. You'll find some political scientists, indeed you'll find quite a few, who will argue that you can't talk at all about democracy. You have to indicate which one you mean, that there's just too much difference from one democracy to the next. This I dispute. And indeed largely on free speech grounds. But to make that point, let me draw an analogy to criminal procedure. Because criminal procedure is one of the areas where we find the most variation across nations. Right? From France to Britain to Germany to Brazil to Canada to you name it, you find vastly different systems of criminal procedure. And so that becomes certainly a ground for some political scientists to say, aha, I told you so, right? You just can't find any coherence between the way that they do it in Britain, the way they do it in France, and so forth, right? So clearly, you can't just generalize about democracy. You have to indicate which one. Again, I would dispute this. I would say that for any society which is more than just a democracy on paper, because of course we have loads of those. Russia is a democracy on paper. North Korea is a democracy on paper. For any society which is substantively democratic, and not just formally so, there is no conceivable situation in which simply picking off citizens from the street, right, and tossing them into prison could be consistent with democratic values. This would just be one example. This would be, right, at the very least, a core of my citizenship is that that can't happen to me. Right? If I'm going to be arrested, if I'm going to be tossed into prison, whether this happens to me under French law or German law or British law, whatever it might be, that there has to be some procedural safeguard, even if there might be high variation from one regime to the next. So this is what I would call, this is what defines the democratic citizenship, right? And, right, irrespective of what liberalism might have to say about it. And I would say we could find other examples. An obvious one would be voting. There's nothing in liberalism, incidentally, which requires voting. I don't know if you ever thought about that, right? Right? I mean, it's amazing how many Hobbesians see Hobbes as a liberal, for example. Right? And so there's nothing about liberalism that requires voting. Democracy is simply inconceivable without some form of it, even though every democracy might do it differently. And so I'll draw those analogies then to free speech, right? I'll say, yes, of course, right, there's no such thing as free speech absolutism. Even the most libertarian society could never be free speech absolutist. I'll explain that later if you want, but you probably know this already. But I would argue that what is germane to citizenship is that a democracy could not tolerate that someone be penalized solely on grounds of their bad worldview, except insofar as risk can be shown. Now, here again, we would have to distinguish, I think, more than governments are currently doing between live and online contexts. In live contexts, this would make me much more protective of speech than I think most democratic governments are today. But that does not mean that I would protect equally dangerous speech online. So I want to use the rest of my time to explain that, because again, I just think that speech scholars are just kind of messing up all these distinctions. The example of generative AI. If you're a liberal, let alone a libertarian, yeah, then your little machine which talks, right, yeah, has to have all sorts of freedoms and protections, right? It's yours, right? Now, I'm advocating a democratic model because, well, yes, your little machine might say all sorts of fascinating things, but it can't be arrested, it doesn't vote, it's not a citizen. You can imagine it's like some of the pub debates I've been having. I mean, they just don't end. They just don't end. Right? And so again, this is why I think democratic citizenship, as opposed to just the abstract liberal individual, is the only coherent starting point, at least within something like a liberal democracy. Again, this does not mean that government should have license to regulate artificially generated speech willy-nilly. But it simply means that such speech cannot be presumed to adhere to whichever citizen happens to own, or indeed whichever corporation happens to own the, in this case, large language model or other generative model. To which I would add, moreover, once then, again, even while protecting the individual live speaker, or indeed the individual speaker on a smaller platform, on a personal platform, which is traceable and so forth, as to major platforms, which, as you all know, now wield more communicative power than most governments, democratic intervention, in my opinion, is the only justifiable option open to us now. Let me explain that. Again, if you're talking to a liberal or a libertarian, there's still the question, they're still asking the question, right? Should we regulate the internet? Right? But of course, as I think you all know probably better than I do, there's no such thing right now as an unregulated internet. Right? Right now, for example, my choice is between either Elon Musk regulates it or the state regulates it. There's no third option there. That might change in 5 or 10 years, right? So the question is, which is more democratic? right? The question is, well, should it be unregulated? Yeah, well, maybe, right? But tell Elon Musk that, right? Under a regime in which Elon Musk wields, again, more power than pretty much every government on the planet, right? And wields, again, a speech which we cannot say flows from his core citizenship. We have to conclude that the democratic option is to choose between Elon Musk as regulator or democratic processes as regulator. I choose the latter because it's more democratic. Another argument you'll often hear from liberals or libertarians is that, yes, but what about the listener's right? Okay, so some AI machine, just spits out something. It may be illegal, but once it's out there, don't I have a listener's right? And this, again, I think is just a kind of non-argument. Any right, no matter what the right is always limited by harm that might cause in its exercise. Again, this goes back to the Enlightenment, and certainly any jurisprudence of rights that you'll find today. And so there's no way in which simply being a listener would exempt you from that. So if listeners' rights have to be subject to a risk calculation just like any other right, then the listener's right is no different than the free speech right, i.e. it's subject to risk calculations and to limitations based on those calculations. So for your friends who start talking about listeners' rights, tell them they need another drink. And so the kind of overall model, because I know we lawyers, we get into these sort of obscure details. So the kind of overall model that I want to kind of move toward, it's not airtight, is I want to see much more government attention on the internet and away from individual speakers, actually, right? And so I would very much repeal a lot of the current law which we've had now for decades, which punishes individual speakers solely on viewpoint selective grounds, right? But that doesn't mean I therefore go for a kind of a libertarian option, because the calculations of risk are very, very different offline and online. And I'm very favorable and quite partial to democratic intervention in cyberspace. And so, incidentally, also as a practical matter, I think it makes much more sense, right? That, I would say pretty much leave individuals alone, focus on where the real risks are, but I don't want my argument to be a purely pragmatic or consequentialist one. I do think it is grounded in the notion of democratic citizenship itself. Of course, I realize I'm drawing a distinction between major and minor platforms, which might be tenuous and might be particularly subject to evolution, even within a rather short time frame, right? 5 or 10 years from now, this might not be much of a distinction, or it might look very different than it does today. But again, because I think that cyberspace can fundamentally be regulated according to democratic processes, I think that distinction itself is one that democratic processes can fairly, not impeccably draw. They will get it wrong. No nation on earth currently regulates the internet well. It is going to be trial and error. Now, another thing that my libertarian friends sometimes throw back to me at this stage in the argument is, oh yes, well, you're willing to have, governments intervene in speech, and, what if it's a government you don't like? And of course, they're all thinking Trump. I don't know why they don't just say it. Right? So they're all thinking, and to which my answer is, I guess, the oldest answer in the book. You'll never get a democracy just on paper anyway. You can have the best First Amendment that was ever conceived. But if you have a government in place that fundamentally wants to subvert it, it will. We've seen this in Poland, we've seen this in Hungary, we're seeing it now in the United States. All the democratic norms in the world You can put them all on paper, but if a government is not fundamentally committed to them, you're not going to have a democracy, or you're going to have an extremely flawed democracy. How much time do I have? Sorry?
I think like 10, 15 minutes.
Well, I'll go through my little diagram. I'm one of these sort of, anal retentive sorts of people who needs diagrams. So let me try, because I know that I've kind of been talking in all sorts of directions. So just to suggest to you that there might be an order, might be a method to madness here, let me try to delineate a few distinctive types of scenarios. First, as I said at the beginning, we cannot lose sight of the distinction between individually targeted speech, right? Death threats, individually targeted harassment, stalking, whatever it might be, whether it's online or offline. Again, even most of the most zealous free speech advocates are perfectly willing for that to be regulated, and it's simply a misconception that they're not. And for me, this is also perfectly legitimate. So as to individualized targeting, whether it's live or online, or hybrid, viewpoint selective penalties may indeed be legitimate. This is an area in which a government can prima facie regulate. Again, the real problem is with generalized speech. The distinction I would make now, anno 2025, again, I'm quite aware of how quickly this technology is evolving, but if I had to kind of freeze my position to place for now, I would distinguish on the one hand between live speech and small platforms, right? Those which simply do not, in other words, basically sources of speech which do not have the kind of power that we've been witnessing through the internet. And there I would argue, there I would kind of take the Brandenburg 1969 test, which again, many democracies today would still reject. I would say that if there is no substantial risk of imminent lawless action, again, I know that there are fluffy terms here. That's the law. Law is always dealing with fluffy terms. We have to get as precise as we can, and we'll always make mistakes. That's what law does. But where there's no substantial risk of imminent lawless action, in a live speech scenario, right? In other words, if it's just Hyde Park Corner and a lot of people just spouting nonsense, there should be a strong presumption of non-intervention. Viewpoint selective regulation is presumptively illegitimate. By the same token, where there is a substantial risk of imminent lawless action, and lawless, so it could be violent, it could be violence against persons, property, whatever, if it's going to be illegal, right, then a viewpoint selective regulation is presumably legitimate. So this is how I would regulate live speech and small online platforms, knowing, however, that they can become absorbed, right? We have hybridity. They can be absorbed into major online platforms. And so the real problem, I think, today, both is and should be the regulation of the major online platforms, right? The X and Facebook and Instagram and all of that, right? And here again, I would say where there's no substantial risk of lawless action, viewpoint selective regulation is presumably illegitimate. So for the most problem, yeah, I think we would all agree, yeah, let the large language models, yeah, let them speak. I mean, let's face it, we all use them now, right? And for the most part, they can be quite helpful and interesting and, or, at worst, innocuous. But where there's a substantial risk, where there's a substantial risk of lawless action, viewpoint selective regulation is presumably legitimate. What did I do?
Oh, I just have an immediate question.
Oh, okay, great.
You left out the imminent for the major online ones?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for pointing that out. Yes. I'm so glad you said that because it's kind of the whole point of what I've been trying to say for the last however long I've been talking, right? Yeah, in live speech situations, I really think the Supreme Court of the United States got it right in 1969. It has to be more than just bad ideas. And incidentally, this was a very left-wing court, probably the most in American history. And they were reacting essentially to McCarthyism, where people had been tossed in prison or had their lives ruined simply because they had bad ideas, right? So even though the particular case here had to do with the Ku Klux Klan, right, rather different than Bolshevik revolution, nevertheless, they say you need to show that there's a really risk that something is going to happen, right, from this speech, and that it's not just abstractly bad, right? That doesn't work anymore online, I think, because I think we have just too much evidence of mass killing, of teenagers committing suicide, of all sorts of, harms. That just wouldn't have made sense in this world, right? In 1969, had the internet been around, they never would have reached that decision. And I think not enough people in my profession are really paying enough attention to these distinctions. So I'm kind of sketching out some things that I've kind of published a few weeks ago, and already I'm revising my ideas, because it's, even as I listen to some of you, right? But this is a kind of first attempt, but there's more to come, because I still feel like there are some problems here and there. And I'll just finish on the following note. In the event that any of you happen to be wandering around Leuven next week, I'm going to be talking about similar ideas. This is to celebrate the 600th anniversary of the Katholieke Universiteit from Leuven. It's not actually about online speech, but I think about a sphere which raises very similar problems, which became all too clear to me when Natalie was talking, right? About problems of someone like Chantal Mouffe, right, who loves this idea of lots of conflict and strife, and it's all open. And the last place where you go nowadays to find that is a Western university, and that's really bad. And so I'm going to be chatting about. So I won't be talking about the internet, but if you happen to be around and you're interested in academic freedom, then I'll be arguing that the academic community cannot impose its own restrictions on speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eric, for a fascinating talk. So we have time for questions from the audience. Carlos, you were first. Maybe if you could speak in the microphone.
Oh, well, okay. Improvement. Yeah. Hello, thank you so much for the keynote.
What is your name? Unfortunately, since I wasn't here the last few days, I don't know anything.
Sorry, I don't think I've introduced myself. I'm Carlos. I'm doing.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm a PhD researcher, colleague with Tom, Trisha, Sam, Natalie, other people in this room as well. I really enjoyed the keynote and all the theoretical journey that you took us through. My main question would be, because I think theoretically it makes sense, the argument that you are, or even ideologically, the argument that you are making of like imminent versus non-imminent. My question is, if you don't use imminent as a tool to define if you should regulate or not regulate, how are you defining the risk? How are you defining when, or could you give an example of when speech in a large online platform is gonna derive in an actual harm or not? And if we cannot do that, should we just go back to the imminent factor in order to define it?
This is what I have been trying to figure out, and I'm still trying to figure out. So I can't say that I have 100% confidence in my answer. And this is why I really wanted to point out earlier the real risks of overregulation. That sometimes you're actually censoring the activists, the people who are trying to combat heteronormativity or racism or whatever it might be, right? Or forms of exploitation, or who are, genuine political dissidents, and right? And this is the danger that I think you raise is that even with the best of intentions, we may overregulate, i.e., we might suppress not simply legitimate, but really important, democratically essential speech. So that's the risk of overregulation. The risk of underregulation is death. Okay? Death, harm, violence. Right now, no government is getting this balance exactly right. I don't think any legal regime currently is going to get it exactly right. The DSA and so they're going to stumble. They're going to make mistakes on one side or the other, and that's precisely why I think it has to be subject to open and transparent democratic processes. But that's not a great answer that I'm giving you.
Yeah, thanks. Really. Oh, yeah. Even better. Yeah, thanks. Great ideas. Very interesting. I like one of the things you said in particular, which is the recognition that, of course, nothing is unregulated right now. It's just that it's Elon Musk rather than democratic control, which I think is a really important point to make over and over again, because people think that doing anything now is imposing something terrible on the internet. Well, no. You're already in a world that's run by these characters. Now, but what I'm wondering is, how do algorithms fit into this? Because they are sort of somewhere in between Elon Musk and the state and individual people, because even now, a lot of speech is being regulated by machines that even their creators don't necessarily understand. So how do you deal with that sort of technological layer that's intervening between our control and free speech?
Yeah, and I'm exactly right. I suspect that Elon Musk wakes up plenty of morning surprised at what his algorithms have done. And all the rest as well, right? It's beyond the capacity now of any human mind, which is precisely why I think I'm not sure I can do better than the answer I've just given, right? Which is why I think all the more reason why it has to be in the democratic arena, right? And it's going to get it wrong. In other words, yes, states in this regulatory process will need their algorithms. And algorithms are going to be crude, particularly when they're regulating, right? Now, I think, again, a baby step in the right direction is that penalties don't necessarily have to be, well, okay, I mean, for lack of a less clumsy way of expressing this, penalties don't necessarily have to be punitive, right? What I mean by this is that we don't have to toss everybody in jail. We don't have enough prison space to do that, right? And so, as you know, a regulation can simply be, a warning, a takedown order, right? There are all sorts of things that we can do to intervene in highly dangerous speech, right? Without necessarily tossing people in prison. Again, I think this is what the DSA was largely designed to do, to have many intermediary steps, to have, hopefully some back and forth, right, with tech companies, at least some of which might be cooperative. Again, that's still a very big unknown, what kind of cooperation we can depend on. But yeah, I mean, if someone can find the ideal role for algorithms, it's not going to be me. It's going to be crude and messy. And for me, that's a reason. You see, for the libertarians, that's a reason not to regulate. For me, that's precisely the reason to regulate. Yeah. And to make the regulation, again, open and transparent as possible. If China's doing the regulation, it doesn't matter how democratic it is. It's not going to be democratic. It's going to serve the interests of the Chinese state. We can only hope that we can at least do better than that.
Thank you very much. My name is Sam, by the way.
Sam?
Work here at CD2I Center as well. And I have to apologize because I have a lot of questions. Like, I found it a really interesting presentation. So I'm trying to figure out the question as I go along with asking it.
I know the feeling.
But it's about, we've talked about like shortcomings of governments here and there, also about like a conflict in understanding between the liberal side of things and the democratic side of things. But what I've seen in my research is that governments, especially the EU, for example, uses democracy more as like an empty or legitimizing signifier, saying like, we protect democracy, therefore we do these things. Whereas, you know, the far right basically says the same thing, right? So this is what I mean with like an empty legitimizing signifier. So from your perspective of your understanding, I wanted to drag out the conversation out of cyberspace by asking the question, what institutional reforms do we need to achieve democratic intervention to make it possible?
I want to go back to your first comment, right? You know, it seems to me you're making almost a kind of Derridian right, you're right, comment about a concept like democracy. I mean, I would even go a step further. I would say all across the spectrum, right? And for centuries, right? Or if, unfortunately, you know, Derrida and Schmidt kind of meet up here, right? Yeah, all of this arsenal of political ideology, yeah, is easily used as we, to use your phrase, empty signifiers, right? Legitimating discourses, we might call them as well, to, you know, to achieve things which are often quite remotely related, right, to the supposed shared understanding of that political value. That's one reason why I introduced the ECRI. I think you probably immediately noticed that, right? Because again, this is all done in the name of the, you know, of the European Commission. Incidentally, I'm not a Brexiteer, so I get to be critical of Europe because you can see the posters on my window at home. Right? Liberal Democrat, right? Anyway, it doesn't matter. So that's the reason I use the ECRI general recommendation, because it's so obviously undemocratic, and they just didn't think it through, right? Again, you know, these are people in their little bubble, and they're all very nice if you talk to them, and you're right. But you know, to really implement what they want us to implement, right? I'm not sure there would be much speech left. Man, did you notice how many dots I had to put in? I mean, if you read the whole thing, there's so much speech that can be censored, right? So yeah, this is just a very roundabout way of agreeing with you. Yeah, that these, you know, and I probably should have said this at the beginning. The salient point about liberalism and democracy is that they're infinitely deconstructible, infinitely malleable, infinitely weaponizable, right across the political spectrum. Yeah. Yeah, and again, I can only come back to my rather banal suggestion that this is precisely why it needs to stay in the democratic arena and not become this, you know, not become the province of oligarchies, of completely opaque oligarchies.
Thank you, I completely understand.
Hello, thank you for your keynote. I'm Jan.
Jan.
Yeah, okay. So I will also kind of frame question as I go along. You know, your differentiation between the individual and the general. Okay, okay. But then the question is, it's connected with the notion of immanent versus non-immanent, and it was already addressed. And then how would you, aren't there a certain possibilities of discerning specifically now, because, you know, it's not just about the speech on the media platforms. There are certain patterns evolving from which you can discern certain potential perceived future harmful acts. So, you know, you can, and then the question is, how do you regulate this, I don't know, in terms of some kind of systemic risks and in terms of just simply utilitarian approach towards it? I don't know, is there any other approach than utilitarian that can regulate that?
I'm not sure. It's a fantastic you're making a number of good points, actually, I think. I wouldn't say that risk assessment necessarily presupposes utilitarianism. Utilitarian, whether or not your solution is utilitarian depends on how you're construing risk, right? Right? In other words, weighing it against benefit. Oh, I'm so glad you brought this up, right? Right? Because you see, once you get into a utilitarian calculation or a consequentialist calculation, then you're kind of saying, well, how harmful is the speech as opposed to how beneficial is the speech? That's not at all. I'm not saying that you're doing this, but this is a risk, right? Is that, right? I do not, when I'm talking about the core of citizenship, right, which has to be non-viewpoint selective, what I'm saying is that the individual has a certain right of speech, irrespective of whether it benefits anybody. So if we can show harm, that might be a reason for limiting it, but we don't have to show a countervailing benefit as a reason to vindicate it. So my argument would be that we have to take risk into account, but not as part of utilitarian calculus, or even a consequentialist one, right? So my whole point of core citizenship is deontological and not consequentialist. In other words, what necessarily follows from being a citizen, right? Such as certain criminal procedures, such as the right to vote, and going down the line, right? And a certain core of speech, even if a periphery of speech certainly can and must be regulated. Something else I would say, I'm not sure if this was something you were getting at the beginning, but with respect to speech, I used to have a number of complaints with Speech Act theory. I only named one of them. In other words, with this idea that that speech is already conduct. Again, this is kind of dogma now in Western academia. You just have to accept this, that speech is a kind of, right, speech is conduct, and therefore harmful speech is harmful conduct, right? But let's go to that first premise, speech is conduct. So imagine an overwhelmingly Protestant country with a small Catholic minority, right? A Catholic minority which has historically been excluded and to this day is maybe poorer, right? And they're quite ardently Catholic. And therefore they have very strict views about heteronormativity, very conventional, very orthodox views about heteronormativity. If speech is conduct, then my LGBTQ parade is a violent act against them. You see, the problem with Speech Act theorists is that once they translate it into politics, they're only thinking about their own politics. But why can't I use Speech Act theory for any politics? Why would Speech Act theory only apply to the politics that I like? Right? Right. Speech is illocutionary, it's performative, or it isn't. But it can't be performative only depending on your politics. Right? This is something that they all have messed up massively, I think. I don't know if that really answered what you wanted to say.
It was a bit more pragmatical question. How would you implement? But yes, you partially answered. How would you implement, in pragmatic sense, regulation any other way than in the utilitarian way? That was like
right. Okay. Sorry.
I'm perplexed how you could do that. Because even in the first speaker we have, it's a question of systemic risk, and what they took 10%. If you 10%, if a platform reaches 10% of European population, then it's a systemic risk. So for me, this is kind of a utilitarian approach. So that was the question. Also, another question.
Okay. Yeah.
Why is legal sphere this so preoccupied with the speech, as if the communication is just about the speech, So
Yeah. Okay, let me do that one first, because that one's really easy. And it's the reason I tried to say communication and not speech. In other words, in any jurisdiction, certainly any Western democracy, but any jurisdiction that I've studied, right, it's universally acknowledged that communication can be nonverbal. right? And so, I mean, a famous example would be Hakenkreuz, right? There's a swastika, displayed publicly, right? You don't need a word, but in Germany, that can still get you in prison, right? So no, I don't know of any free speech scholars who restrict, or you can't, because no courts do, or legislatures do. All of them accept that communication can be nonverbal, right? And therefore that regulation, that a legitimate regulation can equally affect verbal or nonverbal speech acts. I think we say speech just by habit, and not to limit our sphere strictly to verbal acts. Yeah? So that's just a kind of a conceptual tidiness. But as I see your point now about the criteria that you use now, again, what I imagine, quite frankly, what I imagine is probably doesn't look so different from the ECRI. I would just tell them to be a bit more careful about what they're doing, right? In other words, you're going to need specialists. Hopefully, again, subject to democratic accountability, to democratic controls. Modern democracies cannot survive without specialists in 1,000 areas, right? In industry, in military, everything. Food, you name it, right? We need democracies rely on specialists. But all I wanted to say before is that I don't think it follows from their risk assessments that they have to be doing a utilitarian calculus, right? In other words, so they can simply be balancing risk against a fundamental freedom, irrespective of the good or otherwise that might result from it.
Yes, so my question is kind of related to what Jan was pointing out. So my name is Carlo, and I'm a behavioral economist. So when you were speaking about risk calculus, I immediately thought if you were implying that actually the state should be then rational in evaluating these risks. So that the idea is that the state, if the state has to act, he needs to use all the information available to evaluate all possible consequences of a speech act or of a message posted online. And then if there is one scenario with a non-null probability which could create an unlawful action, it should intervene. But this would be actually very restrictive. So, but then otherwise, if you don't act like that, if you leave scenarios with low probability of unlawful action to materialize, then actually you're outside of your framework because, I mean, the state had all the information to understand that something was possible. It didn't act, so it couldn't be considered accountable or also responsible for not acting. So are you proposing this? Are you proposing a state that should intervene if it can imagine, given the information it has, that in one possible universe that has a non-zero probability, something unlawful can happen?
In this article, trying to start to anticipate this problem, right? I mean, I think the only way one could rigorously address your problem would be by working through many different variations and examples, right? Here, I didn't have the space to do that, but I just tried to start acknowledging this problem, right? I don't know, Stefan, I guess you'll have heard of this, the Lucy Connolly case. I don't know if this has really crossed borders, but you might have heard about it because it had some international coverage. Now, this was a case, this goes back over the past 2 years. You might have heard about the riots in the city of Stockport, right? So there were these 3 girls who were tragically murdered. Immediately online, it's, let's go get the immigrant hotel. And there was one woman in particular, the wife of a Tory councillor, right, who tweets, something to the effect, essentially goading people to, or at least encouraging people to go and burn down the immigrant hotel. Turned out the perpetrator was not an immigrant, had nothing to do with that hotel. This is what happens online, as we know, right? It's probably happening at this very minute somewhere. And she was convicted. And she did some prison time. Later on, her prison term was reduced, but even 1 day imprisonment for me means something, right? What the press what slipped beneath the radar is that there were other people, either in that or very similar incidents, who were also saying some pretty nasty things, but they weren't doing what she did. She kind of took that next step, right? They were just saying the usual bullshit about immigrants, if I may say so, right? Right? She was actually trying to get mobilization underway for people, again, to act immediately. In fact, one of the things I've written somewhere is that she would even kind of pass the Brandenburg test, actually, right? Right? Because this is kind of funny because, you know, the right wing in Britain, GB News, you might have heard of it, right? They were all saying, oh, you know, they're all defending her, saying, oh, this never would have happened in America. Well, as it turns out, actually, she could easily have been prosecuted in any American jurisdiction, right? If they had the law, but they could do so constitutionally, right? And so, you know, I mean, again, as I've been saying to the others, you're not going to get perfect line drawing. You're going to make mistakes on one, you know, either on the side of really being risky about human life or being risky about censorship. You know, and that's why that's precisely the kind of situation where that's why we need democratic controls, open, transparent, participatory. But they're not going to be but those adjectives do not mean perfect. They won't be. They never do, right? But yeah, rationalism. I mean, there you're doing a critique of the entire Enlightenment. Liberal democracy presupposes rationalism. Right, and not decisionism, as you know China and Russia do. It presupposes rationalism, and that's always kind of stupid. But it's what we are committed to. Yeah, right. I mean, what is rational? Sure, this has been a problem for liberalism and democracy, you know, since the 18th century at least. Yeah. So I don't think it's a new problem, but it does have some new manifestations. Thank you.
So for those who can stay a little longer, there's a sandwich lunch. You're all welcome to join. Thank you very much. That was really good. Yeah, I'm sorry about that.